Hello and welcome to the 6th episode of Season 3 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Melissa Whitecross, coming to you live from Johannesburg, South Africa. If it is your first time with us tonight, thanks for being a part of the Conservation Conversations family. Now, first off, a big thank you to all of you for allowing us to take last week off to join our colleagues in the De Hoop Nature Reserve as part of BirdLife South Africa's annual staff meeting. We had a lot of fun and it was great to reconnect with colleagues, some of who we have not seen in person since before the lockdown back in 2020. The team is fired up and ready to continue the good conservation work that BirdLife South Africa does to protect our threatened birds and ecosystems. Here we are at Kopieleen, enjoying the beautiful sea air and fantastic views of African black oyster catchers. Now, tonight's show takes us into the high upper altitudes of the Drakensberg and Maluti Mountains as we unpack the special birds of the roof of Africa with one of our absolute favorite speakers, David Allan. Now, thanks as always to those of you who continue to generously donate towards our webinars. You are helping us to keep these shows free for all to learn and enjoy. All you have to do is visit the Cricket page or EFT BirdLife South Africa directly using the reference webinars with your name if you would like to contribute towards the production of this show. But let's get into tonight's webinar. David Allan is no stranger to the Conservation Conversations audience, having presented 2 of our most popular webinars on the bird counts of Durban Harbour and the history of KZN pelagic birding last year. If you missed these, it is well worth searching for them on our YouTube channel to catch up. I have no doubt that tonight, in his 3rd webinar, he will continue to entertain and enthrall us all with his tales from the field. David retired last year from the position of curator of birds at the Durban Natural Science Museum. He has a lifetime of birding experience, having worked for the Animal Demography Unit and the Fitzpatrick Institute of African Ornithology at the University of Cape Town. He also served on the Transvaal Division of Nature Conservation and has carried out numerous avifaunal surveys across South Africa as part of environmental impact assessments and the Atlas of South African Birds project, the original predecessor to the current SABAP2 atlasing project. David's also authored and co-authored 5 books and is a regular contributor to BirdLife South Africa's magazine, African BirdLife. He was also the well-deserving recipient of the Gill Memorial Medal at last year's BirdLife South Africa AGM. David, we are so excited to have you here to share your extensive knowledge on birding the roof of Africa. Thank you once again for joining the show, and I'm going to hand over to you to please share your screen with us. There we go.
Thank you, Melissa. Yes, let me try and do that.
I see we got some comments in the chat feed talking about the Black Mountain Pass in Lesotho, 3,240 meters from Roger O'Neill. I'm not sure if that's somewhere that you've gone, David.
Yes, many times over Black Mountain Pass, yes, up to Mahali Dam. Is it coming through now?
It is, I can see it, so over to you. Enjoy, everybody.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Thanks everybody for, and particularly BirdLife, for allowing me to give this presentation on an area that's very close to my heart. I've spent nearly 3 decades, over the last 3 decades, had the privilege of spending a lot of time in the Lesotho Highlands. These are part of the Lesotho Highlands water project, and most of the work I've done in Lesotho has been associated with these 3 dam projects. The first one was Katse Dam here, which you can see my pointer, was the first dam that was built. And we first went there in the 1990s to visit the area before it was inundated. And then had the privilege of staying with that project to monitor it all the way through the completion of the dam, the inundation of the area, and then follow-up work to see what the impact of the dam has been over the long term. And then the second dam as part of the Highlands project is the Mahali Dam over here to the east, which followed up a couple of years later, and similarly was able to get into that area before the dam was built, and then got to do a follow-up visit when the dam had been completed to see what the impacts were on the avifauna. And these both comprise phase 1 of the Lesotho Highlands water project. Phase 2 of the project is here at Polihlali Dam in the west of the Highlands near Mohale. This is a truly huge dam that is currently under construction. And I was also able to do work there on the baseline studies before that dam was built. And as you can see, these are interbasin transfer projects. Katse, the water from Katse Dam, which would normally flow down the Mohale River into the Senku and then into the Orange River system, finally flowing through South Africa in the Orange River. That water is then reverse pumped through a tunnel under the mountains and then comes out north of Lesotho and then feeds into the Mahali Dam system, providing Gauteng with a large part of its water. And Mahali Dam, similarly, a tunnel connecting Mahali Dam to Katse Dam. The water pumped into Katse Dam and then from Katse Dam is then made available again to go into the Gauteng region. And Polihlali will do very much the same, a very long tunnel from Polihlali Dam when it's completed. That will then transfer water to Katse Dam and again from there up to the Gauteng region. So these are massive, even on a global scale, massive interbasin water transfer systems, and a huge amount of infrastructure also associated with these projects that also have impacts on the environment, including on birds. So some of the work I've done has been with associated projects like that, such as pylon construction. I also, long ago, when we were still working on this first Southern African Bird Atlas project, was able to go and move around, associated with being up there working on Katse. Also did work for SABAB1 in large parts of the highland areas. And in latter years also did dedicated vulture surveys for Cape and bearded vultures throughout the whole highlands region. But essentially the work I'm going to talk about this evening is essentially based on the work associated with the dams, in particular Katse Dam and Mahali Dam, with some mention of work at Polihlali. Here's a photograph of Katse Dam in its completed form, a huge concrete dam wall, huge in size, a massive impoundment behind it, some 70, 80 kilometers long amount of river that's backed up behind there. I'd just like to mention before I go much further that I'm grateful to Dr. Warwick Tarberton, who was back in the mid-1990s, who first involved me in project work in the Lesotho Highlands and opened the door to my further work there. And my partner in crime in most of the work in the Lesotho Highlands has been Dr. Andrew Jenkins. And really everything I talk about tonight, he's been involved with virtually all of that work with me. In the latter years, in fact, taking the lead from me and me working as a sidekick to his primary efforts. So if I could just say that, you know, we kind of share a lot of this work with Dr. Andrew Jenkins. And a lot of other people have worked with me in the Highlands over the years on these projects. I don't want to mention all of them, but David Mapiza certainly comes to mind. David is a Lesotho national and was also one of the first people to introduce me to the birds of the Lesotho Highlands. And I hope to one day get to spend more time in the Highlands with him in the future. But anyway, here's a shot of Katse Dam here. And here's a photo of the adjacent Mahali Dam, which is a different structure of dam wall. It's sort of not a concrete wall. It's sort of rubble and rock piles that have been constructed to make the dam, which is not quite as big as Katse Dam, but still an impressive structure. And what these dams do is they essentially inundate the original rivers. So this is a shot of what the Malibamatso River looks like below Katse Dam. And this is what the original rivers used to look like. And you'll see how steep the surrounding topography is. So these dams that are very, very tall are very, very deep because of the steep topography. They're very steep-sided and they don't form shallow, gradual shorelines. The inundation areas are very deep and extreme. And you see, this is what you end up. So you go from that riverine situation with trees and low-lying areas, quite productive habitats, to this vast expanses of open water, like you see here at Katse Dam, which is flooded behind the dam wall. So a huge impact on the local environment that extends beyond just where the water goes. The impacts extend beyond that in many ways. Okay, one of our primary methods at Katse and Mahali Dams of assessing the bird populations in the surrounding grassland natural habitats was to use bird transect counts. These were 20-minute counts done back to back, and we try and do 10 of those in the morning. We take up half the day, and here's Andrew Jenkins and a local assistant working through the grasslands there, undertaking these transect counts. This is what the highest altitude areas look like, the high altitude transect sites. They get to be fairly flat once you get up onto the upper plateaus. And here's a view of some of the mid-altitude and lower altitude sites, tend to be quite steeper, running down to the lower lying areas. And the lowermost parts of the catchments are quite heavily agriculturalized, where the slope allows the planting of crops, primarily mealies, but also some other plants, such as sorghum. But this sort of agriculture is quite tricky because the slopes are so steep that you can have erosion problems with plowing up land like this. But it provides a different habitat to the natural grasslands that we were sampling in the other transect counts. Okay, so let's just look at some examples that I've selected out to just see what we can learn from doing these sorts of transects. The African stonechat's a very common bird in the Lesotho Highlands, and essentially it's found throughout all the different altitudes and habitats that occur up in the highlands. And if you look here, I just want to compare both. If you're looking up and down the columns of this table, we're looking at the different altitudes and habitats. And if you look at across the rows, you'll see those last two columns relate to the summer and winter, because we did counts at different times of the year. And that allows us to gauge the relative abundance of the birds in the different habitats and altitudinal zones, but also how they change seasonally. And of course, the Lesotho Highlands is a highly seasonal environment. You know, in midsummer, it's got a fairly high rainfall, gets very green, and is relatively warm. But wow, that's quite a change comes when winter blows into the highlands. It becomes freezing cold. The vegetation all dies and becomes brown. And for large months of the year, it's often snowbound in the highest altitudes. So it's quite an extreme environment. And a lot of birds migrate away under the challenges of these harsh winters up there, where it becomes very temperate. And you've got a highly migratory avifauna, even if it's only on a fairly local scale. So if we look at the African stonechat comparing summer and winter, you can see this species. We'll start off looking at the first column, the summer column. You'll see that it's increasingly common at the lower altitude bands. So at the highest altitude band, it's only it's less than half the abundance when you come down to the band of 2,400 to 2,600 meters. And then that final entry, there's the agricultural fields, which are all below 2,500 meters. So this is high altitude. But it does occur, and it's fairly common in the summer months, even up to 3,100 meters. And then if you look at winter, you can see this is a partial migrant. It moves off the higher lying area completely. The highest band is just too inhospitable for it in midwinter. And it's really only an occasional wanderer in natural habitats below that as well, down to the 2,400 meter mark. And it's only in the lowermost area in the agricultural fields lying fallow in midwinter that some birds remain behind at the same sort of density as you see they were in summer at the highest most altitude band. And presumably, most of your African stonechats actually move out of the highlands entirely. But a fair number of them are staying behind up on the upper plateau, but getting down into the lowermost river valleys where the agricultural fields are available to them. Let's move on from there and look at the sickle-winged chat, a special bird of the Lesotho Highlands. And you'll see that shows quite a marked difference in that the sickle-winged chat actually likes, in the summer months, the highest most altitudes, and sort of becomes less common at the medium and lowest altitude bands in natural vegetation. So it's the amount of it, the encounter rate of 1.34 birds per transect drops down to about half in the lower two altitude bands in natural vegetation. And it's a bird that never goes into agricultural fields at all. In the summer months, it doesn't like those disturbed environments, only likes natural vegetation. And this species shows a very strong local migration in that it essentially moves entirely off the highlands of Lesotho during the winter. You'll see there that we've got an occasional bird that you'll find in midwinter in some of the lower altitudinal bands, but essentially 99% of the birds have completely vacated the Lesotho Highlands. And I think they go mainly into the plains of the Free State and areas up to Gauteng. You know, it's in midwinter where birds are seen at places like Suikerbosrand Nature Reserve. And these presumably are birds possibly from the Lesotho Highlands, taking refuge in lower lying areas in the depths of winter. Okay, let's go to the Drakensberg rock jumper. And this is the first of the three species that are entirely endemic to the Lesotho Highlands and immediately surrounding high-lying areas of South Africa. If we look at this species, we see again it is common, fairly common at the highest altitude band, a little more common between 2,600 and 2,800 meters, and then again at the next lowest band, a similar abundance to what you're seeing at the very highest altitude. And then again, like the sickle-winged chat, it doesn't go into disturbed environments at all, completely shuns the agricultural fields. Then unlike the two previous species we looked at, you see what happens in winter there is although there is some movement downwards from the highest lying altitudinal band, there is an increase in the medium and lowest altitude natural vegetation bands and no movement again into agricultural fields. And the Drakensberg rock jumper sticks it out through the winter. Even when the snow comes, they may move a little bit further down the slopes, but essentially they do not leave the highlands at all. They are entirely endemic to that region with no altitudinal movement into surrounding low-lying areas. They tough it out up there throughout the depths of that Lesotho winter. They're a tough bird and actually a little bit bad-tempered at the moment. They're a little surprised at how last year the Cape rock jumper got the nod as the BirdLife Bird of the Year, and they were kind of thinking that maybe there could have been a co-bird of the year last year, but that's not the case. They were hoping that maybe followed up this year with maybe becoming bird of the year, but they again failed to make the nod. And again, we have the Cape gannet this time. So the Drakensberg rock jumper is certainly hoping that the sunshine will spread a little further north in choosing birds of the year as we go forward. Just kidding, of course. Okay, and then we look at a common widespread species like the southern red bishop. And you see that southern red bishops, although they can be common in the highlands of Lesotho, their species is strictly associated only with the agricultural fields, with the disturbed habitats, where they can be really common. You know, an average of 3 encounters with southern red bishops per transect in the summer months, but falling, you know, by 6 times that during the midwinter, where again, they're only found in the agricultural fields, and presumably a lot of birds follow the river courses down into lower lying areas away from the highlands in the winter. Okay, so I hope these graphs and these tables and the examples I've given you, I mean, we've got data like this for maybe as many as 100 species, but I just selected some out to give you some idea of the complexities of how different birds are found at different altitudes and show different migratory patterns in the highlands. Okay, let's just have a look at two species that are, you know, for a long time, the African pipet and the mountain pipet were considered to be one species, and then they were split into two separate species when it was realized that they kind of co-occurred in the highlands of Lesotho, or at least in close proximity to one another. But they're very similar in appearance, and their calls even do share some similarities. So they're quite hard to tell apart. And we've had to spend a lot of time paying deep attention to making sure we get the right information when dealing with these two pipets. And this is the pattern that's come out of the data from Katse and Mahali. Essentially, the African pipet is a species associated, like the red bishop, with the agricultural fields, where it's not a particularly common bird, occurring at a relatively low relative abundance, and then moves off completely out of the highlands during the winter months. So you see here, it's only have records here, agricultural fields in the summer months. And if you contrast that with the mountain pipet, the next slide here, and this is the second of our highland endemics after the rock jumper, you see the mountain pipet is up on the upper slopes, doesn't go hang around the agricultural fields at all, and likes to be fairly high up. The highest densities are in the mid-altitude belt at 2,600 to 2,800 meters, but it's also pretty common at 2,000 all the way up to 3,100 meters, with some presence below 2,600 meters. And it's a total migrant to the highlands. When we've done our counts in the winter months at these different altitude bands, we encounter no mountain pipets at all. The whole population has vacated the highlands. And of course, the original suggestion when the species was first described by Philip Clancy was that they make a large circular migration through Namibia and up into parts of Zambia before returning further to the east back to the highlands of Lesotho to breed. But recent observations suggest that it may not be that complicated. It's possible that mountain pipets just disperse from the highlands of Lesotho into surrounding low-lying areas in the Free State, perhaps the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, where they would then be easily confused with birds like Nicholson's pipet and even African pipet. They're similar in appearance, and the gate color, which is so obviously pinkish in the breeding birds in the highlands, may fade to becoming yellow and a lot more like some of the other pipets. And of course, it's silent in the non-breeding season. So these birds in the low-lying areas wouldn't be giving the characteristic call, which is the very best way of differentiating them from African pipet and certainly from Nicholson's pipet. The two photographs I'm showing you here of African pipet and mountain pipet were taken recently in the Polihlali area, where we had a really interesting encounter with the birds, because you were taking a long winding road coming from the fairly low-lying areas up into the highest areas up at 3,000 meters. And we had African pipets, fairly common in the fields and nearby areas like this. One of these birds photographed here was like that. And then we had our first mountain pipet, which is the one shown in this photograph here. And it was displaying and breeding and giving its distinctive call. And then once we got above the mountain pipet to the highest part of the plateau, we actually had both species together, both breeding, displaying, and calling, and were able to contrast the different calls of adjacent pairs of the two of them. And it was never actually came across that at Katse and Mahali, perhaps because in the Polihlali area, there wasn't such a clear gradient between these steep slopes between very high and down to the low-lying areas. And so there's a bit more of a mixture of the two species at Polihlali, and confirming that they very much are good species. The fact that they're able to show these two different morphologies, different calls, overlapping with one another, means they're clearly not hybridizing at any great level. So they're very much good species. Okay, the other thing you learn about very quickly when you do these transect counts is there's a huge difference between the south-facing slopes in Lesotho and the north-facing slopes. The south-facing slopes are shaded from the sun to some extent, and so they tend to be much moister and hence much grassier. Whereas the north-facing slopes tend to be drier and more scrubby, like in this photograph here. There's a more shrubby vegetation, more caroy type vegetation coming in. And this is all driven by the high altitude associated with the extremely cold temperatures in winter. In that cold temperatures result in an effective aridity, what they call an effective aridity that is more desert-like. Despite the relatively high rainfall, the water is there, but for long parts of the year, when these areas are frozen in the winter months, and the water is frozen, the soil gets frozen, the water is not available to the plants, and it effectively becomes a lot more desert-like. And that explains why you get, in the highlands, you get this strange juxtaposition of grassland birds and essentially karoo desert birds coexisting with one another, sometimes with one community on the north side of the hill, the karoo community, the south side of the hill supporting more the grassland birds. So this is a sentinel rock thrush, a bird one associates very much with high rainfall grassland and to some extent high rainfall fynbos areas. And then when you go over into the north-facing slopes, you get birds like large-billed lark, essentially the only place in the karoo, outside the karoo, where you get large-billed larks is the Lesotho Highlands, which technically falls in the grassland biome. But there's a whole suite of other arid zone karoo-associated birds that also have fairly extensive populations on the highlands of Lesotho that are not found in grassland areas elsewhere in South Africa. And that's a list of them there: the red-eyed bulbul, grey-tipped, sickle-winged chat, the karoo thrush, Layard's tit babbler, fairy flycatcher, karoo prinia, black-headed canary, white-throated canary, and yellow canary. So, you know, when you go up into the highlands of Lesotho, a lot of people expect to find dark-capped bulbul. Surprised to see you've got red-eyed bulbul. A lot of people also expect to see olive thrush up there, and then are surprised to find it's a karoo thrush that occurs there. Also, karoo prinia is up there, not Drakensberg prinia. You have to go over the escarpment and down into KwaZulu-Natal and the Free State in the lower lying areas on the outer parts of the escarpment before you'll come across Drakensberg prinia. Up on top there, it's the real karoo prinia, the arid country version in those scrublands. Just makes the area even more exciting. You'll note that there are 3 canaries there from the arid zone areas. And let me also mention, yeah, another reason why I think we've got these arid zone birds in the Lesotho Highlands is that the watercourses drain to the south. It's all the Orange River catchment, and it's draining towards the south. So providing avenues for karoo birds that occur in the south to be able to move up these river courses and penetrate into the highlands. It perhaps might have been different if those watercourses drained to the north. But while we were on the subject of canaries, let me just show you a quick photograph there of the Drakensberg siskin, which is the 3rd species and the final one that's endemic to the Lesotho Highlands. The Drakensberg rock jumper, the mountain pipet, and the Drakensberg siskin, all 3 of those breeding endemics to the highlands of Lesotho. Okay, let's leave the dicky bird community, so to speak, the community of small birds, and change to the other community that we spent a lot of time looking at, and that's the large cliff nesting birds, particularly the birds of prey. And here's a photo of us surveying cliff nesting birds of prey in these highland areas. In the early days, we were doing it along the rivers only before the dams were built, but then after the dams were built, we changed and we had to then use small inflatable boat to get around the dams and then examine the same cliffs again after the inundation. And of course, some areas in the upper reaches of these dams were not inundated. So again, we had to do work from foot or by vehicle. Telescopes, very important components for this sort of work. And the high quality optics that you get from the Swarovski scopes in particular really have opened the door to us being able to do work like this. Okay, well, the most abundant bird of prey in the Lesotho Highlands by quite a country mile is the jackal buzzard. And one really doesn't have to go very far. There's nearly always a jackal buzzard in sight in the Lesotho Highlands. And once we started searching for nests and plotting them, the abundance of the bird was really quite gobsmacking. In the Lesotho Highlands, the jackal buzzard nests are only on average 2 kilometers apart. So every 2 kilometers along every line of cliffs, you've got a pair of jackal buzzards. And this is a very complicated set of maps here. Essentially, the first map on the left-hand side shows the occupation of cliffs by breeding jackal buzzards at the Katse Dam during the baseline study in 1991. And then during the monitoring period in 1996 to 2000, that's the breeding sites there in the central map. And then the most recent follow-up that we did was 2013, 2014, is in the right-hand map there. And there's various different codes to show you which nests were occupied, not occupied, or not, which sites we weren't able to cover every site in every single time period. And the dam wall, of course, is down here in the bottom. So the Katse Dam wall is over here, and this is all the inundation area. And we also covered areas above the inundation area up here, where they were also breeding jackal buzzards. Essentially, I think we had over 50 pairs of jackal buzzards nests that we found and monitored over these years. So an incredibly common bird in the Lesotho Highlands. But what was quite disturbing was that in our last survey in 2013, 2014, which was a follow-up a long time after the inundation, there was a disturbing trend that although a lot of pairs were still present and breeding, and in some cases pairs were present, but without much evidence of breeding, there was a clear trend, if you look down here towards the dam wall, of the sites that were most subject to large-scale inundation were either not occupied, they'd been deserted, or they were occupied by breeding pairs, but the birds weren't actively breeding. And actually the 9 lowermost sites, so that's 9 out of 50, nearly 20% of the total population, seem to be having a problem with breeding during this most recent period. And that, I think, is related to, is likely to be related to the loss of very productive low-lying areas of thick grass and vegetation with rodent populations, etc., which are just lost to these very barren areas of open water. So some impact on the jackal buzzards. Okay, another very common bird of prey in the Lesotho Highlands is the Lana Falcon. We had some 20-odd pairs of breeding sites of Lana Falcons that we came across. They're a common bird in the Lesotho Highlands. And really, there was very little change in their abundance between the 3 time periods of before the inundation. The dam is shown here, but of course it wasn't there in those days. So just use a standard map though. This was during the monitoring period, and this was long after, the map here is a follow-up long after inundation. Lana Falcon numbers have remained fairly constant throughout, the number of breeding pairs occupied from year to year. And Lana Falcons in Lesotho clearly take a lot of domestic chickens as prey. So with a very high human population in the catchment, they may be getting a lot of their primary prey from people by robbing people of chickens. And they have been perhaps less affected by inundation than some other birds because of their prey base being unaffected. The people never lived particularly low down along the river. They tended to always be a little bit further up the slopes, out of the actual steepest part of the gorge, in more the low to mid altitude areas where most people in the catchment live. Okay, and then the last of the cliff nesting birds that I just want to mention briefly is one that it's always hard to get to know well, and that's the Cape eagle owl. You see Cape eagle owls here. I think we had them, recorded them. They're very secretive, so it's hard to know their status, but I think we had birds recorded on at least 20-odd cliffs during the course of the study, and we confirmed breeding at 5 of those cliffs. Not enough information to really tell if inundation has much affected them. In a secretive bird like this, it's just exciting enough to just find them, never mind being totally on top of what's actually happening to them. Okay, and then we come to a third component of the avifauna that one examines in terms of looking at what the impact of these large dams is. And that's perhaps the most obvious one, and that's the impact on the water birds. Your original situation was the river courses like this, And while we were walking along the river courses, surveying the cliffs, the other job we had to do for the cliff nesting birds of prey, the other piece of work we had to do was to count the water birds that we encountered along the rivers as well. So in the early years, that was a lot of walking along riverine habitats. But then later on, we were working from the boats, the inflatable boat. And here's Andrew scanning for water birds with us as we're traveling around in a small inflatable boat. Many, many days on Katse and Mahali Dams with the small boat. And as you might imagine, if you go from a high altitude riverine system, which changes then to a massive, globally impressive sized impoundment, stretching for tens of kilometers of inundated areas, you get some pretty big impacts on your water birds. And some of them are positive and some of them are negative. I'll start off looking at some of the negative impacts. We have a look here at the giant kingfisher. Giant kingfishers were found throughout the river systems at Katse prior to inundation. But then as inundation progressed, and you can see in the 4 maps there with the time periods shown, this was before inundation, 1991, where you see there's just river systems. 1996 is when the dam had been completed and inundation commenced. We did surveys then when the dam was half full. 1997 to 2000, the dam was essentially at full inundation level, and we did many trips during that period. And then this final follow-up trip in 2013, 2014, to a summer and a winter trip to see what the final situation is. And you see it's a sorry story for the giant kingfisher, a bird that was present along the rivers in the original situation. With inundation, it started to become less and less frequently recorded. You see here, this stage, this is two below the dam wall, 2 records, and then records only in the uppermost reaches. And then in the most recent period, you see we could not find any giant kingfishers anywhere along the, must be 100 kilometers of, 70, 80 kilometers in this direction, 30 or 40 kilometers in this direction. Couldn't find a single giant kingfisher. Clearly, these big, steep-sided impoundments don't suit them at all. And the only bird we recorded was in the downstream area where the river still retained its natural state. African black duck is a bird that's a lot more common along the original rivers than the giant kingfisher was. You see here, 1991, we recorded it virtually throughout all the river systems there. And that persisted right the way through the early inundation period. And even for many years after full inundation, we were recording black ducks virtually throughout the system on the dam. But then towards the end, when we came back after this long break, 13 years break, an apparent persistence in this period was starting to sort of show some threadbare signs to it of black ducks not being as common. They're not a bird of impoundments. The African black duck is a riverine specialist. It lives on large insects that it catches in fast-flowing rivers and sometimes not so fast-flowing, but essentially in flowing water. It's not a bird of impoundments as such. And the graph below here just shows the numbers of birds on each of the counts that we carried out. The red here is along the original rivers, the number of birds we counted along the rivers. And then you see for after inundation, they still persisted in numbers, but the most recent counts were very, very low, suggesting that the black duck has really taken quite a heavy knock if you look from the original situation all the way through to what we're seeing today. The hammerkop is a similar, has taken a similar negative impact. The black dots show the breeding sites that we located in the early years along the rivers, where they typically nested in willow trees, feral willow trees that were growing along the river banks. Up here's a nest from the Lesotho Highlands in a typical riverine site. When inundation came in, a lot of them these trees were then completely lost underwater. Many of them moved on to cliff faces where they built their nests on cliff faces like you see here. And they persisted for many years after the initial inundation. But when we went back most recently, essentially it was hard to find a hammerkop anywhere in the major part of the dam. All the breeding sites had disappeared, except for one here up in the very uppermost reaches. So the Hammercock-2 enjoyed the riverine situation, the original riverine situation, and then fell away with the steep-sided deep water situation. You know, essentially any kind of wading bird doesn't do too well on these steep-sided deep water dams. It's more swimming birds that would handle deeper water and steep shorelines. Okay, let's have a look at the red-knobbed coot, a very simple, easy pattern, easy to interpret what's happened here. The red-knobbed coot is not a bird of highland rivers at all. There were no birds present at all in the pre-inundation period. They came in very quickly, though. The first year when the dam was starting to fill up, we started to get our first records, so they're able to colonize very quickly. And then that trend increased as the dam filled up to its full capacity. We found red-knobbed coots throughout the system. But most recently, there was a dropping off of numbers, even though we had one breeding site down here, a little quarry. There was a breeding pair here. The number of birds along the main part of the dam had seemed to decrease. And you often find this with the inundation of a large impoundment. For the first couple of years, it's quite productive because a lot of vegetation gets flooded in the process of the initial inundation, and that releases a lot of nutrients into the water. And that fires up quite a productive system for the first couple of years, even up to a decade of a dam's existence. But then after that, those nutrient levels then tend to drop down again and then stabilize at a much lower level, which is what I suspect has happened here, has been reflected here with what we're seeing with the red-knobbed coot. Look at two other water birds here. The yellow-billed duck, in contrast this with what happened with the African black duck. Yellow-billed duck is not a riverine specialist, but it's a generalist duck, and probably our most generalist duck, and was present along the rivers originally. Impoundment certainly did seem to suit it, especially the early years of impoundment. It, again, was able to colonize very quickly, particularly because it was already there in low numbers, with lots of breeding records. Those black dots represented breeding records, but then a bit of a tailing off again in that final period, 2013, 2014, perhaps with the nutrient bust, boom and bust cycle, having reached the bust situation. Egyptian goose was a winner throughout the country, and that's repeated here on these dams. Much like the red-knobbed coot, it colonized the dam, but it took a long time to do so. You see, it was not present on the original rivers, did not appear in early inundation, and did not appear even many years after the dam had reached full inundation. Despite our counts, year after year, we had no Egyptian geese. But then finally, they discovered the dam and moved in fairly big numbers and started breeding on the dam. And this lowermost photograph here is from Katse Dam, showing the individuals from this breeding attempt here in the middle reaches of the dam. So the Egyptian goose, a real adaptable species, capable of taking man on at his own game, and showing this also in the fairly rigorous conditions of the Lesotho Highlands. But no bird has done as well, water bird has done as well and at Katse Dam as the white-breasted cormorant has done. Let me take you through this as a real success story of this tremendously adaptable and, I suspect, a fearsome predator of fairly large-sized fish. And when you create a huge, massive, deep impoundment that is full of large fish, as the ichthyologist people have been able to have confirmed with us, the bird is able to respond in quite spectacular fashion. It was a common widespread bird in the highlands prior to inundation along the rivers, and there was breeding at the northernmost reaches of the rivers up here. But then as inundation progressed, the numbers of birds increased and they started to breed in more areas in the dam itself. So here's, and this a situation that does not show any diminution over time. I don't think it's a nutrient thing with them. They're just a powerful swimming water bird. And the more water there is, the more scope there is for fish, and the more scope there is for more white-breasted cormorants. and look at the actual numbers here. We were counting 16 birds along the river system before the dams were built. But in these last 2 years, look at the total number of birds counted, 265 and 399, a massive increase in the highlands, along the dam. And here's just maps of the breeding sites. Before inundation, there were a small breeding colony of 4 pairs over here, very uppermost reaches of the river. During the early years of inundation, that breeding colony became a little bit bigger, and a new breeding colony in the middle of the dam, siting itself in a good position for the birds to be able to access all, from a central point to get to more areas of the dam, whereas this is not well positioned to forage in the dam, too much ferrying time to get there, 38 pairs. And then in the most recent period, 140 breeding pairs in 2013, 2014. So a massive breeding colony there. And they established themselves on this island in the middle of Katse Dam, now called Bird Island. And all that white markings you see there is the guano from the breeding white-breasted cormorants. And that's their nests there, a shot of their nests. So a great success story as part of the dam. Okay, what about the small dicky birds again? How are they impacted by the actual inundation in the same way some of these water birds were? Well, I don't want to go into too many examples, but the most striking of them was a surprising one. It's the nediki, and a bird you wouldn't expect to be impacted by major developments. One thinks of it as so small that it would always find patches of habitat untouched by any major development where they'd be able to persist. But that's not been the case. The nediki was a common bird along the rivers before inundation. After inundation, it persisted for quite a while. And when inundation was happening here, it was still there, but then rapidly started to fall away as the dam reached full inundation. And in the most recent period, we were unable to find any nedikis at all, anywhere in the inundation period of the dam, area of the dam, or in the upper reaches either. They disappeared from the upper reaches of the dam if they occurred there as well. And the only nedikis we could find were below the dam wall, where the river retained its original character, as you see as we found with the giant kingfisher. So there was a little bird badly impacted, and a big surprise. One wouldn't expect a small passerine like this to be so severely impacted over such a huge area of land. There's not quite as striking, but it seemed to be a similar pattern at Mahali Dam. I haven't shown you any maps yet of the situation at Mahali Dam. We didn't have as much time spent there, so we didn't have the same levels of precision. But here's just the red-collared widow bird, which showed a similar pattern to what we saw in the nediki at Katse Dam, in that in the original period, we had them quite widespread in the upper areas of the 3 rivers there feeding into the Sentinel River, which is the main river down here. After inundation, when we went there, we couldn't find any red-collared widow birds anywhere in the catchment of Mahali Dam. So that was very surprising because they were fairly common in these upper catchment areas in the years before the inundation period. It'd be nice to have more data from Mahali Dam though, but this certainly was a striking finding. Okay, I'd like to just finish off by focusing very quickly on some of the key red data species, the threatened species that occur in the Lesotho Highlands, and what happened to them at some of these dam localities that I've talked about. And this is the first of them. Most people, when you talk of the Lesotho Highlands, the first bird that comes to mind is the bearded vulture. And here's an adult bearded vulture photographed at the Giant's Castle Hyde, of course. Getting to photograph bearded vultures quite this well anywhere else in its range is quite a challenge. Okay, so at Katse Dam, we had 5 breeding pairs of bearded vultures that we located, either in the pre-inundation period or in the monitoring period when from the period when the dam started to fill up to reaching full inundation. And some of these we didn't find during the early or they weren't there when we did the pre-inundation studies, the baseline studies, and were only found later when the dam was filling up or full. You see here, the site here at Katse tells quite an interesting story. The Katse pair were very close to the dam wall. And they actually, the original nest they started here was this nest here in the south. And when Katse village was created to house the people building the dam wall, there was a lot of rock blasting in this area. And this pair that used to breed here shifted across the river and started nesting on essentially the northern bank of the river at that stage on the cliff there. But then when the dam started to fill up and there was even more disturbance in this general area, they subsequently moved over here to this side. And that happened during this period. They persisted there for several years. But then subsequently, when we went to check them in 2013, 2014, that pair had disappeared. And so had all the other pairs, the other 4 pairs that had once occurred in the catchment. So sadly, we started off essentially in this study with building up to 5 active pairs of bearded vultures. By the time we left there in 2014, there didn't appear to be any active pairs of bearded vulture left in the catchment. And also there was at least 1 pair lost at the Mahali catchment when we checked that. It's possible one receives mixed reports on the pairs on the outer part of the escarpment here and this pair in the side gorge. I'm not totally up to date whether they're still absent from those localities, but I can only talk about when we did our work. We'd gone essentially from 5 to nothing, sadly. Seems to be the story of vultures everywhere. The other one was the black stork, and this falls really into the waterbird counts along the rivers. When we did the original study and search along the rivers, we had numerous sightings of black storks along the original river courses, and located 3 breeding sites, very widely spaced. It's not a bird that occurs at high densities at all. These nests were about 30 kilometers apart from one another. That's the spacing. That's how spaced out black storks are naturally. And their response to inundation was immediate and very, very negative. The 2 pairs in the initial inundation area disappeared immediately, as did sightings of birds in these areas. And then subsequently, by 2014, even the pair in this upper river here had also disappeared, perhaps because of the loss of good foraging areas along the main rivers here when these were inundated. And we had relatively few sightings of the birds along the dam after inundation compared to the number of sightings along the rivers. So clearly this is a bird that likes to fish. It's a wading bird, like the hammerkop, for example, like to fish along rivers and then battling to be able to stand on the edge of a massive dam with a very steep shoreline where it just doesn't really likely have fishing opportunities that it can benefit from. Unlike the swimming white-breasted cormorant, which can get access to all that open water and can dive underwater to be able to benefit from the fish of an inundated dam situation. The black stork does not. And I'm sure that this is reflected throughout Southern Africa, throughout the range of the black stork, where rivers, natural river systems disappear and are replaced by either degraded rivers that are running dry because of too much water being pumped out of them, or are being inundated to build dams for human water purposes. Okay, let's look at a slightly happier story, and that's the yellow-breasted pipet. I want to talk about yellow-breasted pipet on all 3 sites, actually, and build up to what my final conclusion is with the status of the yellow-breasted pipet in the Lesotho Highlands. In 1991, when we did all this work at Katse at the various altitude bands, we didn't come across any yellow-breasted pipets at all, anywhere, in all that weeks and weeks and subsequently months and months of walking around at different altitude bands. During the monitoring period, though, we got 2 records. We had 1 bird at a mid-altitude site here, but then we got several birds suddenly appeared at this site here at the very highest altitude study site we had at Katse Dam. Now that site was very interesting because it was demarcated as a nature reserve called the Bakong Nature Reserve. And a large area of grassland and shrub land was put aside and protected from grazing. Now, when you go to the Lesotho Highlands, there's no fencing. So livestock, sheep essentially, rove across the entire landscape, grazing everything essentially very, very flat at a very constant rate. This Bakong area is not fenced off, but there's a local agreement with local people to keep their livestock out of this demarcated region. And that's been going, when that happened, was established back in 1996. And as the years went by, the vegetation in that area, the grassland, regenerated and became thicker and denser and lusher, presumably like its original situation would have been with, before the grazing of sheep. And on our last visit up there, we suddenly found that yellow-breasted pipets had become common in this high altitude area, the Bakong Nature Reserve, and were actually breeding there as well. They were a common breeding bird, displaying and carrying food. So suddenly you had this, breeding population re-established in the face of protection from grazing. Mahali just reinforces as the same sort of grazing regimes, with sheep allowed to rove throughout the entire catchment and essentially grazing the grass down to virtually nothing on an ongoing basis. And we only recorded yellow-breasted pipet, presumably one vagrant bird on one occasion in one square in that catchment, and no sign of them at all in our follow-up visit. So not doing well there at all. In the Polihlali catchment, most recently, last couple of years ago, all the bird work we did there, we only found one single yellow-breasted pipet, and it was probably a member of a breeding pair. And that bird was again at a small protected upper catchment area that's protected from grazing by fences because it provides the main water source for Mohale town in that area of the Polihlali catchment. So this suggests to me that before there was livestock on the Lesotho Highlands being held on the land summer and winter at a very high constant grazing pressure, it's likely that yellow-breasted pipets were widespread throughout the highlands of Lesotho. And that would have been a population potentially of thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of breeding pairs across the massive highlands of the Lesotho, of that region of Lesotho. And it's been taken out by intensive grazing, and only in small pockets where there's some sort of protection do you still get yellow-breasted pipets. And up at Bakong here, this is up at 3,100 meters, which is a very high altitude, for this species to occur, but it seems it can occur there. And the other place in Lesotho where you get it is a nature reserve, so its name escapes me at the moment, in the far east of the country, again, which is a protected national park. Sorry, brain's got too full. And there you get yellow-breasted pipets there. But certainly, wow, it would be great to see more areas protected from heavy grazing in Lesotho, such that yellow-breasted pipets could be able to come back into that landscape. And then finally, the last bird I'm going to talk about tonight is the southern bald ibis, one of our most charismatic Southern African endemics, and a bird that we found very common at Katse, nesting on the cliffs there, also at Mahali with breeding sites on the cliffs. But I just want to focus particularly on the Polihlali area, where we found the birds again to be even very common and breeding in high numbers there in the Polihlali catchment. The Mahari Dam here, this is a rather low resolution map of it. Sorry, let's go back here. The dam is going to be, the dam wall for Polihlali is going to be over here. So with the legs of the river here that will be inundated, stretching back there. And Mohale town, so we're in the northeastern highlands of Lesotho. Many of you will know of Mohale town. Mohale is actually the Lesotho word for bald ibis. So the town is named after the bald ibis. And from the surveys we did in these areas, the dam has not been built yet. It's under construction at the moment. And our study was to do the baseline again in the rivers before they are inundated and in these steep valley gorges, again, with lots of cliffs, same as you have at Katse and Mahali, we were able to find 196 breeding pairs of southern bald ibis in the Polihlali inundation area. So in other words, that 196 breeding pairs are going to go underwater when the Polihlali Dam is constructed. And this is a particularly high concentration of southern bald ibis, more so than we had at Katse Dam, and even more so than at Mahali Dam. 196 breeding pairs. The globally population estimate for the species from the Red Data Book of South African Birds that came out a couple of years ago by BirdLife South Africa had a global population estimate of 1,645 to 2,500 breeding pairs. So that Polihlali population is 10 to 12% potentially of the global breeding population of bald ibises. And they could have their breeding, that is threatened by a single development, potentially more than 10% of the global population threatened by a single development. And I know BirdLife South Africa is doing some follow-up work in that area, I think working with the authorities in charge managing the Lesotho Highlands water project to follow up on what can be done to potentially mitigate the impacts of these dams on the southern bald ibis. But it's a great bird to leave you with, as a charismatic bird of Lesotho, as it is of some of the other parts of Eastern South Africa. And let me wrap up at that point and say thank you very much for listening through this presentation. Thanks a lot.
Wow, David, thank you. What a phenomenal overview of the changes that have happened in the Lesotho Highlands and how they've influenced our birds. And I think yet again, just showing the incredible value of these long-term data sets. And a massive thank you to you for summarizing all of your years in the field up in the Lesotho Highlands and sharing some of those fantastic findings with us. Before we dive into some questions, just a reminder, everybody, if you do have any follow-up questions, we'll be taking a couple this evening. So you can use the Q&A box. I see quite a few of you have popped them into the Q&A box, but just share them with us. And you can also share your appreciation with David in the chat feed, as I see several of you are currently doing. All right, David, let's dive into some of these questions. There are many. People have really, really enjoyed your talk. And I'm just going to ask you to stop sharing your screen while we answer them. And we'll kick off. There we go. we're gonna kick off with a question from Jonathan Stacey, and he was asking, considering all three inundation projects, how significant are the losses of the red data species, particularly something like the bearded vulture? If you want to just speak to that, I know you showed the southern bald ibis quite clearly, but something like a bearded vulture, how serious is this?
Yes, I think that when you're dealing with red data species that are globally threatened, you have no leeway to even think that the loss of small numbers are acceptable. You're no longer able to do. You have to try and protect everything that's left, especially when you get up into the categories of endangered and critically endangered, like many of these species are. But I think the thing that I did learn from all this experience is that it's not just the dams. The dams are part of something that opened up the whole highlands. The dams came with power lines, they came with roads, they came with changes in the way people used the landscape. They had to live in different areas. They had to change their agricultural practices. So lots and lots of impacts come on the back of the original impact, such that you can no longer tell whether the dam was responsible for the loss of, say, like the bearded vultures, or more likely it was the associated developments. So it's the juggernaut of human development that comes rolling into town, with this town being the Lesotho Highlands. And what we need to do as conservationists is, as you see in BirdLife doing, as you yourself do in your work, and that is sort of razor sharp identifications of all the mitigations you can do to try to find ways to keep these species in these landscapes by all kinds of various techniques that will allow us to work with the developments, because they can't be stopped, but mitigation can be done. So yeah. So for bearded vultures, essentially you're finding alternative food sources for them, trying to reduce the chances of collisions with power lines and things, education so that the local people are positively disposed towards the birds, etc., etc. These are the kind of ways we can try to compensate for the harm that is being done by these developments.
Absolutely. No, thank you, David. And I know you mentioned Polihlali, where we are currently working with the Lesotho Highlands Development Agency, particularly on the southern bald ibis. And one of my team members, Karina Pinoa, has done some extensive work teaching the LHDA officials how to monitor southern bald ibis and black stork, and also showcasing what was done at Ngula when they built the pumped storage scheme there and the sort of artificial bald ibis colony that was built there, learning lessons from that process and hopefully applying them to the Polihlali area, potentially blasting more cliff face higher up out of the inundation zone. As you said, 196 odd pairs or individuals is just not an acceptable loss. And we've got to ensure that these birds can persist in that landscape. So hopefully, as you say, there are mitigation options. We've obviously just got to make sure that these are A, ethical, and B, going to be a functional solution to try and save these birds in that landscape. But yeah, great to showcase a partnership where we can learn from previous work that has been done and hopefully secure these very, very important high altitude sites, as you said. And I thought it was so interesting, the example you showcased with the yellow-breasted pipet, another species which Karina's been working on at Ngula. We know our climate change models for the species are looking really dismal in the South African sites. Going forward, 2050, 2100, we're gonna get too hot in South Africa for the species to persist well. And having these high altitude areas for these birds to escape to is absolutely crucial. So knowing things like you've just showcased in your talk is so imperative for us to turn our focus towards as the broader conservation community and work with partners in Lesotho to change those grazing regimes and find ways for people to still graze their livestock, but do it in a way that allows things like the yellow-breasted pipet to still survive and keeps those grasslands nice and healthy. So thank you for showcasing that. And I see we've got a question from Jonathan as well, just asking around the sort of funding of these dams. Are these largely the sort of big development banks driving this sort of infrastructure, David?
Yes, it's been large. I think that the World Bank was involved, certainly with Katse and Mahali. I'm not sure what the funding is with Polihlali. The South African Department of Water Affairs seems to be a lot more directly involved in what's happening with the Polihlali project. So I'm not entirely sure where the funding is coming from there, but I would imagine there probably is international funding coming in for that. And often that's quite important as a lever for getting good environmental work done. If there's an international funding, there tends to be more pressure to do detailed environmental work than there would be if there isn't international funding. Unfortunately, some people, if they're not being pressurized into doing detailed work, then they will not, because it is expensive.
Absolutely, yeah, we do have to commend those development banks. They certainly do try and strive for the best environmental outcomes where possible. We've got two questions, one from Rob Simmons and one from Inika. Just asking around two species that you didn't happen to mention, the Cape vulture and the ground woodpecker. Did you survey those, and are there any insights you can share with us on those two species?
Yes, the problem with Cape vultures is that once you start talking about them, you don't talk about anything else, as one tends to find. So I thought it best to stay away from it, because there are some the Lesotho Cape vulture colonies are relatively small and scattered rather than really big ones, except in the far south of the country where there's a very big colony in the Kuteng area. But otherwise, the colonies are very small and scattered. There are some at Polihlali, at Katse in the main catchment and Mahali catchment. No, they weren't. They were a little further away on the outer escarpments. So it wasn't front and center for most of our work. Even at Polihlali, there were just two small colonies. So I thought, no, I wouldn't bring them into the mix of the broader Cape vulture conservation effort. In terms of ground woodpecker, yes, they're again a common bird in the Lesotho Highlands. well, as common as they can be, they're never that abundant. They seem to have big spatial requirements. But yes, they occur up to the highest altitudes in the natural habitats, and they were regularly counted on our counts with no clear evidence of any, being threatened or decreasing over time. But they're very much a feature of that highland avifauna.
Fantastic. Now, I know you were intricately involved in the original SABAP project, and we've got a question here from Katse asking whether there are any plans to do some new or additional SABAP surveys across Lesotho. He's noticed that there are very few pentads that have even a single protocol card. I'm not sure if that's something you've got in your sights, David.
Perhaps I'm just getting a little long in the tooth to be able to tackle the atlasing of the Lesotho Highlands. It is worrying to see just how poorly covered Lesotho is in SABAP 2. It really sticks out in the coverage maps. And yes, it would be nice to see some sort of focused effort. If some funding could be found, certainly from either within Lesotho or outside Lesotho, to get more atlasing done in that country, that should be encouraged. I think people would be keen to go in there. It's the conditions are quite rough though. You need to have good four-wheel drive vehicles. The distances are long. It's challenging, but it's massively rewarding. It's a different world up there. I always know when I go into the Lesotho Highlands, it's like stepping into a different universe, and you leave all your old life behind you and you go into this new place like nowhere else in the world that I know of. So I would encourage people to go birding in Lesotho, but just make sure you're well prepared to do so. And yeah, yes, SABAP 2, it would be great to be able to see those gaps being filled.
Definitely, yeah, a great call to action for any avid atlasers who are up for an adventure. Certainly not easy conditions moving through those high altitude zones, as you said, David, but a worthy cause, and maybe something we as the landscape team need to look at a little bit more closely and make sure that we are getting those high areas surveyed, especially as we move forward into a very uncertain climatic future where they are going to be critical for some of our high altitude species. Just looping back towards the sort of dam effects, we've got a question here from Shashi asking around the effects of dam building in other parts of the world. This is an incredible data set that you and Andrew Jenkins have been able to develop and showcase. Do you know of other studies similar to what you guys have done that show potentially similar effects or completely different effects in other parts of the world?
No, I'd have to confess I haven't gone out of my way to look into the literature, other than one hears of many negative impacts of dam building, in so many environmental ways and also human. But, clearly there are also the advantages of having this water available to major metropolises. So, but I am sure that each and every case would have its own merits and would find its own findings unique to the situation to it. But I'm sure it'd be interesting to look for common threads between what we've seen happening in Lesotho and perhaps in other areas. But I must admit, I've never pursued that myself.
Absolutely, yeah. It's certainly something to potentially look at for anyone interested in this topic. David, you mentioned some of the vegetation, and being a botany trained ecologist, it's certainly something I've always loved watching as one moves through those high altitude bands. Just can you give us one more reminder and rundown? I know you mentioned kind of the changes in vegetation, but as someone moves from the lower altitudes of Lesotho upwards, what kinds of vegetation changes can they watch out for?
Well, the key one is that, the switch of the north and south facing slopes, the dry and wet, between one favoring grass and forbs and the other one favoring more shrubby conditions. So that's probably the most striking thing that you notice. But the higher up in altitude you go to, there often is some protection from grazing the further up you go. So you do get you're better likely to find better preserved grassy areas the higher up you go, and in the more remote regions that you move into. But the people do keep their livestock there. It's shepherding systems, so the young herdsmen do take the livestock up into the mountains through the summer, And in recent years, they say even are keeping them up there more and more in the winter. Yeah. So these, those are some of the changes. And I think with heavy grazing, there's also, that also is to the advantage of the shrubby vegetation. Because certainly where there are areas where they corral stock overnight, or where there's little drinking points in the mountains at seeps, then you tend to get more shrubby vegetation in those areas too. So, keeping your high quality, it's your high quality grasslands that are most under threat from grazing and trampling as well. Trampling is very powerful, I think, in this environment as well. The people move a lot on horses with their very hard hooves. And, a lot of the botanists say a lot of the damage also comes from trampling from horses in particular along the paths that the people use, which in those steep slopes can then lead to erosion.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. And I think a trend that's also showcased lower down in the grasslands, where we get that overgrazing impact, and particularly trampling within our wetland systems, we've noticed can be a real problem, and being those high wet zones probably also experiencing that challenge. Just getting back to your south and north facing slopes, Eleanor Mary was asking, were the plant species of diorama on the south facing slopes?
Sorry, what are they?
The diorama plant species that you mentioned, were those on the south facing slopes?
Oh, I don't know what plant that was.
Okay, I assume it's one of the ones you popped up on a photograph. We'll have to go back. Eleanor, if you don't mind popping us either another comment, or we'll try and follow up with you via email after this. But I guess one question I have for you, David, just in terms of foraging and impacts on the birds, we know things like your vultures require kind of dead animals in the landscape. Did you see a big reduction in the presence of things like sheep in these landscapes after the inundation? Did the rural communities move their livestock to other areas?
Yes, I think there was indications that because they were losing grazing grounds to the inundated areas, they would have had to have moved higher up into the mountains. And that that was one of the reasons why they tended to graze at the highest most altitudes throughout the year, instead of just going up there in summer and bringing the livestock down into the valley bottoms in the winter. They'd lost that to inundation, so they had to keep them at the high altitude areas throughout the year. So it increased the grazing pressure higher up.
Fantastic. Well, David, I think we've answered plenty of questions tonight, and all I can say is thank you so much. My last one for you is, do you have any particular favorite of these high altitude species that you've so incredibly shared with us this evening? What would be your favorite one you love to see?
I think it would have to be the bearded vulture. There is no bird that epitomizes the mountains like the bearded vulture does. And there's nothing quite, even now, if I'm in the Lesotho Highlands and you see that gigantic delta wing shape come over the horizon like a gigantic falcon, your heart skips a beat for a moment. There's nothing that flies quite like them, other than the albatrosses. And strangely enough, they fly very much like an albatross. It's a long, thin wing, and they use wind action to fly. And they tend to fly quite low down along the ridges. They're not high soarers like, say, Cape Vulture does. So you watch them dropping their bones at the ossuary sites they have. There was one at Katse where we could sit at the side of the road and watch them dropping the bones on the rocks and then go down to pick them up. And then watching them swoop in and out of their nest sites, and often you spend hours and hours driving, walking on the boat, and then find a bearded vulture nest is one of the highlights of any raptor person's career. To see the bird go into the cliff and into a pothole, and you see the nest, and it mate stands up and comes out of the pothole, and the two of them change over, and the bird that's been incubating is relieved, takes to the air. Within minutes, it's lifted out of sight and gone away on its foraging. I mean, that's the essence of what the most fantastic birds are all about. So yeah, it's got to be the bearded vulture. Second bearded vulture, third bearded vulture.
Goosebump stuff, David. Thank you. That's I don't think I could sum it up any better. What an incredible evening it's been. You certainly have taken us to one of my favorite parts of Southern Africa to bird those high altitude areas, and I cannot agree more with you. Those bearded vultures do take your breath away when you are lucky enough to see them. Thank you for sharing your fantastic knowledge of this wonderful area with us, and I hope everyone will rise to David's challenge that can, and will head out into the Lesotho Highlands and help us collect data that we so desperately need to understand what is going on out there. David, thank you for sharing all of your incredible knowledge with us. I don't know if you have any last sentiments before I close off and punt Gareth Tate's lecture next week.
No, Melissa, just to say thank you very much again for allowing me to talk to everybody, and thank you to everybody for listening to the talk. It's a great honor and a privilege to have such a widespread audience through this technology, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share the magical times I've had up there myself and with my companions over the years. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thanks for all the effort you put into that. And as always, you are welcome back anytime. We love having you on the show, and we look forward to the next one. But thank you so much, everyone. As I said, Gareth Tate's with us next week for another raptor-focused talk. We're going to be talking martial eagles, the behemoths of the South African and African savannas. So do join us. It's going to be another great presentation, and we look forward to hearing Gareth talk about his incredible work on these endangered raptors. Well, I'll see you all next week, Tuesday, same time, same place. Thank you for spending your Tuesday nights with us. Happy birding, and keep your eyes on the skies and keep enjoying those birds. Good night, everyone. See you next week.